Bonjour, je suis Véronique Fournier, directrice générale du Centre d'écologie urbaine de Montréal et je suis très heureuse de vous accueillir pour ce premier événement d'une série de 3 événements sur la transformation des espaces publics par les données. Ce lancement conférence se déroulera en français avec la conférence de Birgitte Svarre en anglais. I welcome you all. I welcome you all. I'm Véronique Fournier, Executive Director of the Montreal Urban Ecology Center. The present event will be held in French, but our guest speaker talk will be in English. I make this precision because we know that there's people with us from different places or also different backgrounds that are joining us for this launch event. Nous sommes aujourd'hui, ce midi, près de 500 personnes qui proviennent de tout horizon, de différents endroits. On vous invite d'ailleurs à compléter un court sondage pour mieux vous connaître. Donc, c'est à l'écran. J'en profite avant qu'on débute dans le vif du sujet pour vous partager quelques indications avant de débuter. Donc, la conférence sera enregistrée et accessible par la suite. Les micros et les caméras des participants sont actuellement désactivés. Il y aura une courte période d'échange suite à la présentation de Birgitte et les questions pourront être partagées dans la boîte questions-réponses et elles vont alimenter, bien sûr, on n'a pas la prétention de pouvoir répondre à toutes, mais elles alimenteront cet échange à la fin. Questions will be taken either both in French at the end of the presentation by Birgit, so you can share them in the box, the Q&A box. It will help us to nourish the talk for the end of this conference. Si vous avez des problèmes techniques, les coordonnées de la personne ressource sont actuellement envoyées dans le clavardage et elle pourra vous y répondre au besoin. Donc, je suis très heureuse aujourd'hui d'ouvrir cette conférence. Récolter des données pour bâtir des villes à échelle humaine. Car c'est le fruit de plus de 10 ans de collaboration avec Gehl, d'expérience sur le terrain et de recherche, tant par le Centre d'écologie urbaine qu'avec d'autres professionnels, pour tenter de capter la vie humaine et rendre tangible cette idée de placer l'être humain au cœur des milieux de vie. C'est en primeur aujourd'hui, vous avez le déroulement à l'écran, que nous vous présenterons la première revue et mode d'emploi des études de la vie dans les espaces publics au Canada. Puis, nous accueillerons pour l'occasion Birgitte Svarre, directrice chez Gehl et co-autrice de l'ouvrage « La vie dans les espaces publics, comment l'étudier ». Nous terminerons cette heure ensemble par une période d'échange autour du sujet. J'aime toujours commencer, lorsqu'on parle d'études dans la vie, de la vie dans les espaces publics, avec cette phrase d'Enrique Peñalosa lorsqu'il était maire de Bogota. Ce qu'il nous dit finalement, c'est qu'on n'est pas très outillé pour connaître la vie humaine en ville. Hein. Nous en savons plus sur l'habitat du tigre de Sibérie que sur ce qui fait vraiment un milieu de vie urbain habité, qui est sain, qui est durable, qui est agréable pour l'être humain, qui est finalement lui aussi un animal social, si on peut le dire ainsi. C'est cette idée précise d'écologie urbaine qui est au cœur de la mission du Centre d'écologie urbaine depuis 25 ans maintenant, cette année, pour créer des environnements et pour l'être humain qui sont capables aussi de se régénérer sur le long terme et des environnements qui sont aussi capables de faire face aux défis climatiques, démographiques, économiques et naturellement celui incontournable que l'on vit actuellement, la crise sanitaire. Le Centre d'écologie et Gehl, justement, partagent cette conviction qu'il est urgent de concevoir des villes à échelle humaine. Des villes qui sont aménagées pour que les gens se sentent en sécurité dans les rues, envie de les fréquenter, pour y jouer, pour y lire, pour faire du sport, pour se déplacer à pied, à vélo ou simplement y flâner. Donc, il est dorénavant, pardon, incontournable de s'intéresser fonction et refléter aussi les populations qui l'habitent. La question qu'on peut se poser, finalement, c'est qu'est-ce qu'on connaît réellement de la vie humaine dans les espaces publics? Les individus les plus vulnérables, comme les enfants, les aînés ou les personnes en situation de handicap, est-ce qu'ils peuvent évoluer en toute sécurité dans nos espaces publics? On peut se poser des questions comme où les adolescents se regroupent-ils pour faire quel genre d'activité? Certains enjeux majeurs aussi, par exemple d'équité territoriale, sont méconnus. Pourquoi les femmes fréquentent-elles moins les hommes que les hommes que certains lieux de nos villes? Au plan de la mobilité, aussi, même si on connaît bien les chiffres sur la circulation automobile dans nos villes, bien, paradoxalement, euh, on dispose encore de peu de données sur les déplacements qui sont faits à pied ou à vélo. Devant ces enjeux-là, bien, ces enjeux-là, pardon, qui sont cruciaux, bien, les impressions qui sont individuelles ou anecdotiques ou encore, par exemple, des éditoriaux fracassants, bien, ils ne peuvent pas suffire ou être les seules bases sur lesquelles on va justifier ou abandonner les projets d'aménagement, de changement de programmation ou d'adaptation, par exemple, de règlement municipal. Dans cette perspective-là, bien, ce que ça nous dit finalement, c'est que l'urbanisme ou l'idée d'aménager les villes, bien, c'est une science et comme toute autre discipline, bien, elle requiert à la fois des données et des analyses. Pour évaluer bien, les qualités réelles des initiatives qui transforment nos villes, bien, il faut aller sur le terrain, compter, observer, mesurer, décrypter les faits et ainsi être capable d'établir vraiment un portrait qui est raffiné, qui est construit puis qui est structuré des espaces publics. Et il faut également aussi, pour bien appréhender ces enjeux d'aménagement de l'espace public, bien, reconnaître cette importance aussi de récolter des données, le décompte des usages, des noms. Issus d'une association commerciale ou communautaire ou encore citoyen, bien, vous pouvez mener ces études. C'est dans cette idée-là, d'ailleurs, qu'en 2019, le Centre d'écologie urbaine a mis en ligne des outils et le site aussi, lesespacespublics.com, pour démocratiser ces méthodes et qu'on puisse s'approprier finalement des manières d'aborder la vie autrement. Donc, aujourd'hui, bien, nous lançons cette première revue et mode d'emploi des études de la vie dans les espaces publics au Canada, à la fois pour fournir des arguments qui nous permettent de récolter des données, l'analyse, l'addition de données à échelle humaine, qui va nous permettre aussi, cette publication-là aussi comme objectif de dresser un état des connaissances sur les études de la vie dans les espaces publics et leur rôle, de recenser, de décrire, d'analyser des bonnes pratiques et des défis aussi à leur mise en œuvre et finalement aussi d'offrir un guide qui va faciliter la création à terme d'espaces communs de qualité. Parce qu'à travers cette première étude de cas de démarche faite au Canada, bien, ce qu'on a appris finalement, c'est que les études de la vie dans l'espace public sont utilisées de 4 manières au Canada. D'une part, à la fois pour du réaménagement, de la planification, de la programmation ou de l'expérimentation d'intervention sur le domaine public. Et ce que nous dit aussi cette première revue, c'est que ces études-là sont utilisées à la fois, par exemple, pour l'élaboration de plans d'urbanisme d'ensemble ou de grands secteurs d'ensemble, mais aussi bien pour le réaménagement de corridors de transport ou encore vraiment un parc de quartier. Donc, pour encourager cette transformation des espaces publics par les données, bien, la publication va retrouver un plaidoyer qui fournit un argumentaire en faveur des études de la vie dans l'espace public, un état des connaissances à partir des concepts clés et un inventaire de 10 études canadiennes dans différents contextes. Et dans ces études, ce qu'on va y retrouver, elles vont présenter, par exemple, des illustrations concrètes, tant de la finalité, le site, le résultat, les méthodes sur ces 10 démarches qui ont été faites au Canada. On va également retrouver dans cette revue des illustrations concrètes aussi d'utilisation des données et des différents indicateurs qui sont possibles lorsqu'on met en place ce type de démarche. Par exemple, où les gens vont se poser, quel type d'activités vont le faire dans l'espace public. Dans ce cas-ci, par exemple, on a l'exemple du ratio homme-femme dans le centre-ville de Vancouver. Donc, il nous donne des indices aussi sur comment l'espace public est utilisé ou non et quel type d'intervention pourrait être planifié. La publication aussi, cette recherche démontre aussi que ces méthodes ont des impacts et des échelles d'intervention qui peuvent être très variées, que ce soit le design d'un parc, par exemple le parc Bercy à Toronto, qui a fait l'objet d'une étude de vie dans l'espace public, aussi bien qu'une stratégie complète pour le centre-ville de Vancouver dans le cadre de la stratégie des espaces publics, mais en même temps aussi pour refléter parfois les particularités hivernales, dans ce cas-ci, les terrasses froides dans l'arrondissement du plateau Montréal. Avec cette publication, ce qu'on souhaite faire, c'est qu'on prend le pari d'accélérer l'utilisation des données à échelle humaine et on y propose un guide pratique issu de l'expérience concrète de professionnels des différentes municipalités qui ont mené ces démarches. Parce que révéler la vie humaine dans la ville pour créer de meilleurs habitats, c'est au cœur de cette démarche et du lancement de cette publication. C'est d'autant plus important dans le contexte actuel sanitaire. Chacun d'entre nous a pu expérimenter, je dirais tant avec la tête qu'avec le cœur, l'importance des espaces publics dans son quotidien, particulièrement en ville, que l'on pense aux parcs de quartier, aux corridors sanitaires ou encore aux artères commerciales qu'on a progressivement animées aussi au rythme du déconfinement, ou encore même des promenades aussi simples mais distanciées avec nos êtres chers. On a tous, je crois, encore plus apprécié l'espace public et les potentiels et les défis auxquels aussi cet espace public fait face. C'est donc dans ce contexte que nous avons réinvité, et je dis bien réinvité, Birgitte Svarre parce qu'elle était avec nous en 2019 lors du lancement de la traduction de How to Study Public Life. Elle était avec nous à Montréal en 2019 pour ce lancement. Et nous avons demandé d'aborder comment certaines villes réussissent à adapter leurs espaces publics pour faire face aux grands défis du 21e siècle, tant les changements climatiques que la densification, par exemple, des centres-villes, et particulièrement avec l'attention aussi du contexte sanitaire actuel et de l'importance des espaces, où l'importance d'espaces publics de qualité est encore plus cruciale que jamais. Je le mentionnais d'entrée de jeu, on aura la présentation et suivra une courte période d'échange aussi, donc n'hésitez pas à partager des questions à travers le bloc de clavardage, de questions-réponses. I will now invite Birgitte to share with us our perspective on public life, public space study, facing all the challenges that cities are facing, especially in this crisis context. So we're very glad to re-invite Birgitte in Montreal, but in distance today. So, well, I will have a warm of applause, but it will be online for Birgitte and
Thank you so much, Véronique. It's a pleasure almost being there. Really nice to be with you. And I'm looking forward to sharing this presentation with you. I will start with a brief introduction about Gehl. I'm assuming some might know as well, others not so well. So just a brief introduction about Gehl here from Copenhagen, where we have our headquarters. And then I will also talk a little bit about these public life tools, not so much in details, but just a brief fly-in. And then I will look at some examples of studies that we've done during this strange period in history, this COVID time that is not yet finished at all, but look at the patterns we can see and what we can learn from, and then also give some examples, some answers in these times, and what can we use those learnings for. So that's mainly the topics, and I think you can see them on the next slide, please. Yes, here you see the 4 themes that I'm going to talk about. And as said, the first thing I'll do is just briefly introduce Gehl. Who are we? Well, we are a design practice based here in Copenhagen, but also in San Francisco, as well as in New York. And I think we see that on the next one, please. Exactly. So here I am in Copenhagen. You see some of my colleagues, but also fantastic colleagues in San Francisco and in New York. And we've also been happy to work in Canada and also in collaboration with you. Next one, please. And we do not only work in North America and Europe, but also elsewhere. And it's really fantastic to have the ability to work with these themes that are relevant all over the world as we see it. Next one, please. And we've done that since 2000 and been able to study public life and collect data from all over the world, but also work more strategically and with design. Next, please. And when we do it, the headline is always making cities for people. If you read Jan Gehl's books, you might recognize the headline Cities for People, but that's always the headline for work. And then we approach the wicked problems we see. So we work for more equitable, more healthy, and more sustainable cities. And to do so, we always think whether you're an organization like us, or whether you're a city, whether you're a private entity, you really need different backgrounds in order to make it. You need different types of heads sitting together and finding good solutions. So we also have different backgrounds here. And then, of course, we also really appreciate all the good partners that we work with, like you also in Montreal. And the services we provide, just to give you an idea, well, we work with this public life data that we're also going to talk about today, or I am going to talk about today, but also the processes, the strategies, how do we make healthier, more sustainable and more livable cities, but also mobility is really a growing field where it's no longer just about transport, but really how can we do much more than transport, much more than mobility, much more with our streets. I'll come back to that. And then we also work a lot within master planning in new developments, but also transformation of city areas. Yes. And that was the very brief story of Gehl, and now comes the very brief story of public life, public space studies that are really tools to make life visible in planning. That has been the idea right from the beginning when Jan Gehl started, but also with other good colleagues, also in Berkeley, in New York and elsewhere, trying to push this agenda about people that were invisible, also as Véronique mentioned in her introduction. And we were really happy when we had this publication come out, How to Study Public Life, La vie dans l'espace public, comment l'étudier en French in 19. And also that we had these fantastic ladies you can see here, Madame Plante, Méris in Montreal, and then also Madame Hidalgo from Paris writing the forewords. And then you see this photo, and it seems as if it's ages ago in a different world, but we actually gathered in Montreal and had the launch of How to Study Public Life, and we're really happy for the support of supporting the publication, but also really happy to see the launch today of this work with different cases from Canada. And if you say very briefly, well, what is this all about, this studying public life and these tools? And you also saw some good examples in the introduction from Véronique. It's really about making people visible. Well, how do you do it? You just take your pen and paper, and then you go out and look at what works, what doesn't work, and really observe the activities taking place. As Véronique also said, it could be about gender, who are actually there, like in Vancouver, but it could also be at different times of day, different times of the week, and so on. So really trying to understand life and how it unfolds in the cities where we live, and what works and what doesn't work so well. So these are tools that are accessible for everybody, regardless of background, and really available for everybody. And then this is an example following up on the Vancouver example about gender. So this is one example of these public life tools being used in Bryant Park in New York, where you have the park officer, and then he has a clicker in one hand going out every lunch break, and then clicking one click for every woman, and then a click for every man. He also has, his survey sheet stating how many homeless people are there. And then you have the threshold 52% women, that's the threshold. If it's below 52% women in Bryant Park in New York, if you've been there, you know it's a great place. It wasn't always like that. And then they know they need to do something. They need to do some changes. There's maybe something about safety, etc. So that's really a tool that they use in the daily maintenance and so on of the park here in New York. And then it's always fun to go out and have a look. And fortunately, this was when you were able to travel, and I was lucky enough to be in Montreal and also look at Place des Arts and see, you know, all these people on this beautiful day in May hanging around. And here it's of course interesting with this lens to see, well, how many people are sitting, why are they sitting there and not over here, etc. But also to see the temporary installments that were there in place in May 19 and see how they're used, by whom are they used, and so on. So this is really an occasion to pose a lot of questions. I also went out and did a small count around lunchtime on the 22nd of May, as you can see, a Wednesday, and counted at this specific spot 4,320 people within the hour passing by this point. And then you might say, well, that's fine. Is it a lot of people? If you've been there, a lot of you have. You also know it's a lively place, but let's see the next one. And then we can start to compare with other streets. And that's, of course, also the interesting part, to compare within a city, but of course also with other cities and see, you know, how you're doing, so to speak. And if we look at Montreal and Place des Arts, if we just go back one, we can actually see that it's actually doing quite well, even on a Wednesday, not a weekend where people are out, but at lunchtime, a lot of people are out there, and it's actually comparable in terms of numbers of pedestrians passing by with Broadway, for example, or Regent Street in London. So yeah, next one, please. And back then I went out and I was standing there with my clicker, just like in Bryant Park, manually. And I think that's a great way to do it, because when you do that, you also see other things. You start to notice nuances and understanding life and how it unfolds. Quite often we are stuck in our offices, especially now, and we do the planning at the table on the computer, but really getting out and sensing the places and also this structural approach to how it actually works, building on that is really great. We can also do it digitally now, and that has of course been great also in these times to be able to send out people on the distance during the COVID period. So we also have this app where we plot down different types of activities, age groups, etc., as you can see. Next one, please. And then not only looking at public life, making observations about the life unfolding, the different types of activities, but also, of course, what is not happening, but also assessing, and this is one tool to do an assessment or like a dialogue tool to look at. And again, you don't need to be an expert, but just go out and actually rate whether this place is a place where you can sit down, where you can stay, where you feel safe, and so on. So it's not looking into the statistics and looking at the crime statistics, but it's really sensing, is this a place where you would also feel safe at night? And of course, also putting on other glasses or lenses and starting to think about, what if you were here alone as a girl at night? Would that also be safe, etc.? So different criteria, a structured conversation around the qualities, assessing the public spaces, and trying to understand life more in detail. So that's like the brief introduction to the public space, public life tools. And then the next one, because now we will look at some examples. And the examples today, and you can of course find many more great examples in the publication launched today from Canada, from different places, but I'll zoom in on the findings we have during this COVID period, because I think there's something super interesting in these findings. It's like a magnifying glass on trends that were already there with digitalization and so on. So let's have a look at those findings, the next one. And as you can see, there's a web page also at the top of this slide where you can go in and find much more information on these studies, both in Danish and in English, not in French, I'm sorry. But as you can see, the key questions have been to study live unfolding the use of public spaces during lockdown. But of course, it's also interesting in this period to see the different periods, the first lockdown and then reopening phase, and then it has of course continued after that. So what can we learn? Let's see the next one. And the way we did it was to send out people in different parts of the world, but also what I will primarily focus on this talk, 4 cities in Denmark of different size and so on. Yes, let's see the next one. And then also combine it with the big data. But not only doing observations, but also asking people, and here it is in Danish, I'm not expecting you to understand that, but the qualitative studies, asking people about what are the activities they're doing, what is, are there any public spaces they visited that they would normally visit, and so on. So really a lot of valuable information came out of these studies. Next one. And what was really clear, and it has been to everybody, was that the inner cities were really suffering. And this is one example. This is from the main shopping street in a medium-sized town in Denmark. Horsens, it's called. And you can see on the columns that there was a significant drop in activity. I've been in that street, and even on a Tuesday, it's lively. You have people out there promenading, going into shops, but now it was just dead. No one there. So really a significant drop. Inner cities suffering, but again, this magnifying glass zooming in on trends that are already there. Quite interesting. Let's see the next one. And this is then from the inner city of Copenhagen, another one of these 4 cities that we looked into. And as you can see below, we had before data. That was also the criteria for doing this, that we actually had some usable data from before, and then could compare it with these days during COVID. So around the same weather on these 2 images from the same place in inner city of Copenhagen, and almost, as you can see on the right-hand side, really, really empty. So not a lot of things happening, and of course the shops are suffering. Next one. And then what was interesting to see was also the things we started to do. And as you said, Véronique, in your introduction, we really recognized that we appreciate having public spaces, but also need them to go out, and started to do more play and more activities out there. So of course it wouldn't no longer be the cafe seating. If you can see it on the right-hand side, it's much more about playing and so on, other types of activities taking place. Next one, please. And then also very important, not only that inner cities are suffering, but the recognition of local places, that local meeting places are even more important than ever, was very clear in this survey. You could see an increase in the number of people using this square. That's really in my neighborhood here in Copenhagen, a local square with a playground and where you can sit and so on. But really a lot of people going there. So even though there was less activity, less cars, as you can also see, there were more people staying there. So really, really this need for local places. And then the next one. And that's just emphasizing that it was really the local size that the local places that a lot of people used, not only in the lockdown period, but also in the reopening phase and onwards. And then the next one. And then we looked into some of these places to see, well, what is the distribution of amenities? And the conclusion from this study was that it really mattered to have a diversity in terms of amenities, both civic facilities, communal facilities, cultural, but of course also food, beverage, and so on, retail. But that you had that mix was sort of the key to success as well. Next one, please. And then, of course, I think what is very interesting and what can also make me worry somehow are the changed mobility patterns, where we see in a lot of cities, including here, that people change patterns, of course, out of necessity. So they bike more, they walk more, but they also take the car more. And the public transportation is really suffering these days. So I think it's super interesting how that is going to continue. So some of the key findings, just to summarize really briefly, struggling city centers, almost empty shopping streets, and these local neighborhoods with increased activity, but also this urge for greenery, going out to nature, to new places, but also within proximity of where you live, and mobility patterns changing. But what we could also see, I didn't show that here, in terms of who are actually out there, age groups, we saw a lot of children, a lot of elderly that were out there, and also doing different types of activities as well. And then, of course, there's something about the cleaner air, also interesting with the drop in traffic and what are going to be like the new demands post-pandemic. These new skills, we've also done surveys, we've looked into people, social distancing and so on. So we also have some categories specifically for that. But I think it's super interesting to look at the patterns and see, well, what can we actually learn from this hard period in time that we can also use moving forward to make better cities for people. So those were some of the key findings during lockdown and the reopening phase. So that's to frame it a little bit square-like, the problems. Well, then what are the solutions? And that's, of course, a little bit like like this. It's not meant like that, but I thought it was interesting to bring some cases and also some general principles for resilient cities. So I'll do that. And this is the first slide that is going up in the helicopter and talking in more general terms, based on a new publication here from Gehl, from David Sim, our creative partner, and as you can see with a foreword by Gehl. And it's called Soft City. And I think there's a lot in these principles for Soft City. And those of you who are familiar with the Gehl projects and the thinking and so on, to you, it's not a revolution what you see here, these principles, but really this has been an attempt to say, well, not only how can we study public life, but also then, well, how do we then create great neighborhoods and work on that scale, and how to do that. And that's presented here in Soft City. Let's look at the next one, please. And of course, there are many other things out there, including 15-minute cities or 1-minute city in Stockholm, or in Paris and so on. So a lot of these thoughts and trends are shared. And this is some of the work that we do in China, but I think it's really been like a push that there's a leap now. There's a moment in time where it's even more obvious how relevant it is because of the time we're in now. Next one, please. And again, coming back to the amenities, that if we talk about density and dense cities, it's really not only about the density and the number of people or square meters or square feet. It's really about proximity, what you have within walking distance, but of course also cycling distance if you are living in a cycle city, and how can you reach those everyday functions and so on, to also get social exchange. I think that's also the really clear image we get now, that we are these social creatures, and we want to go out and see other people. Véronique, you presented how around half the people, or 58%, they live in apartments in Montreal. I don't know the numbers of people living in single households, but I know the numbers here in Denmark, and it's around 50%, or at least in Copenhagen, more than 50% of the people are living alone. So of course there's a need to go out and socialize, and that's also where the public spaces play a role. But of course you also need a reason to go out and things within reasonable walking distance. Yes, next one. So density and diversity equals proximity. And then if we say, well, solutions, this is of course a temporary solutions, and I know you've also had some great temporary projects in Montreal, like in many other cities around the world. And here we are in Mountain View in California, so a little bit further south, and on Castro Street, the main street in Mountain View, we've been part of putting in these temporary facilities that you see on the left. So using Castro Street because there was a need for that in this period in time in a different manner, and with social distance and everything. But also when you invite people for this, you can see that they will now. But of course also super important for the local business. And I think when we move forward in time, it's clear, but also if we moved a little bit backwards in time before COVID, that the shops, the retail, the traditional shopping street, the inner cities, they're really suffering. And for them not to become dinosaurs, hopefully there are some inspiration from this period in time. Next one. And I think this is really also where the cities can play a role to support the businesses, the local businesses, but also just support the everyday life of people as well as cultural life and so on. So now we're no longer in Mountain View, but we are in Copenhagen on these maps. And here you can see to the left-hand side, the public space network go to the right, and you see it in 2020, 22 years later, where you have many more connections, where it's a completely more fine-grained public space network with more options, where it's also overlaid. It's not only shopping and with the main shopping streets and then some side streets, you also have the cultural facilities and institutions that are connected with it, recreational, the harbor is in play much more at this point in time. So really these layers supplementing one another, so to speak. So then the next one, and this is then one example, just going down at eye level to see, well, what does it look like? One of the streets that has been upgraded is this one called Vester Voldgade. So a very Danish name, and now an everyday route and also an alternative to a very busy route parallel to it. And then the next one. And that of course gives street lives and so on. And here you have two of my fantastic colleagues, Helle Søholt, CEO, and Eva Vestermark, also here from Gehl. And they've been part of this bridge, pedestrian and bicycle bridge, a new connection crossing the harbor, as you can see on the map in the back. So not only upgrading existing streets, but also adding new connections to improve the conditions for pedestrians and cyclists. And if you look at Copenhagen these days, there's actually not been that many temporary projects, and at times I can be a little bit, we should do more, this is a unique chance and so on. But I think it's also because it's a robust network, and I think in many cities where it's actually quite well working, there hasn't been this panic in these times because it actually works quite well either way. And here you have then the cultural institutions being also better connected, but certainly also institutions that we need to take into account if we look a little bit post these pandemic times. They're truly suffering, and how can we also help them as well as retail to flourish in the coming years. Next one. Yeah, so this is part of a new cultural district in Copenhagen, and we just take the next one. But again, connecting and then staying in Copenhagen, and I'm not sure you can see so much on the right-hand side because that's where the photos are, but still it says this thing about small children and how they actually breathe in much more air than adults, also meaning that they get much more of these polluted particles. So just the next one, just to give you a brief example of a project where we also take in these data and where we've been out and doing registrations and so on. and supplemented it with other data and looked at air pollution data and where people actually walking and staying and so on. Let's see the next one. And then we could see that there were some places where people would actually, of course, you would dream of a city without pollution, but meanwhile, while you get there, how can we actually live with the pollution and make it better, adjust the behavior? Next one. And we looked at streets like this in inner city of Copenhagen, where a lot of people would actually spend time there, but where the quality of air was also quite poor. And then the next one, and then started to working with visions of greener, putting in elements like greenery and so on that would actually improve the air quality and especially the small particles. Let's take the next one. But again, building on all of this data. And then this is where I'm going to end. This is project we're working on, a vision. This is how it is today. This is the central part of Copenhagen. And I think it represents, if you see the next one, this vision, where we are going, where we are heading post-COVID. Let's take the next one. A greener vision for this place, a healthier Copenhagen. This has met a lot of backup, but this is with Tivoli, the amusement garden on the right-hand side here, that we are working with them to hopefully realize this project, but a lot of political backup as well to create these local greener meeting places in the city, certainly. And then the next one. Yeah, so to sum it up, and I'm sorry if you don't see the last sentence or all of it, but we'll make sure we also share the slides afterwards, I'm sure. But in summary, we've been looking at, in this period in time, how public spaces and parks are really the connecting tissue in many cities, but also a health resource, super important. It's not only just nice to be able to sit outside in a cafe, it's actually vital. And then this thing about active streets, walking, cycling, even more evident that we need to promote it much more. And then the thing about 15-minute cities, why it's not only a good slogan, it really makes a lot of sense in terms of making robust cities. And then, of course, also the systemic changes, the climate actions, working with air quality, with health, and so on to change it for the better. So the next one, please. So a lot of learnings, and those were the words from me. And now we also have some time for some questions, I think. And if they're in French, I think you'll also be happy to translate them, Véronique, as I understood it. But thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Birgitte, for this glance and this overview on public life, public space studies in the context of this COVID, but how it can magnify, as you say, like solution for our cities. Merci beaucoup, Birgitte, pour cette présentation. On vous invitait à partager des questions, des échanges pour animer une courte discussion avec notre invité aujourd'hui. J'aimerais peut-être lancer la question en partant. So I'll start with a question first. In our publication, in our study, we've looked at different cities across Canada, and some, for instance, were more like on the park or small scale, but there are cities such as Toronto and Vancouver that have done like broader public life, public space study. How would you, and knowing that, for instance, Montreal is now undergoing on its process of its new urban plan, and probably some other big city as well, how would you, or how, can you share with us the interest of carrying on this kind of studies at a different scale, either like the smaller one, but as well like the bigger one? Just before you answer, je vais demander à Birgitte un peu pour mettre en contexte. Dans l'étude qu'on a fait, il y a des études qui se font dans les petites échelles, d'autres à l'échelle, par exemple, du centre-ville ou du plan d'urbanisme. On estime qu'elle aborde l'importance ou l'intérêt de mener ce type d'études-là à différentes échelles et qu'est-ce qu'elles peuvent apporter finalement dans les solutions à des villes durables.
Well, I think there are different ways of using these tools. I think it's there is certainly an interest to gain more evidence of what is actually happening, and as you said, we've had a lot of numbers on like traffic flow and so on, but to see it in a broader perspective and also understanding human behavior, I think there is that interest. But I think the way I see it, if you look at those studies, like a little bit up in the helicopter right now, there's always they're maybe more like thematic, so really addressing whether it's health, working with healthy neighborhood plans, whether it's working with certain themes. We've also worked with health and teenagers and food and so on. So I think there are like new emerging themes. Again, I think the reason for using is also to bring some evidence to the table, of course, also documenting, effects, using it with pilots, also small scale. I think that's also very strong that you do that. But then, of course, I also see it as a sort of a way of engaging people. I mean, you can go out and ask people, but it's really also interesting to go out and look what they actually do, because they might say something else, and to actually see, where are people going, where they're not going, who's there, and so on is super interesting. And I think it has relevance in terms of engagement, not only in that way, but as a supplementary tool among other tools in an engagement toolbox, so to speak. And also very interesting when done with, like I know also some of the cases with the local neighborhood groups where you really engage people and where they have a new look at their, whether it's a neighborhood, whether it's a city, that's also a way of engaging people. So I think it certainly has relevance, yes, but maybe in more like thematic and also, small scale and large scale ways. Yeah.
Merci. Donc, ce que Brigitte ajoutait aussi, c'est que les études sont aussi une manière d'engager les communautés à être partie prenante aussi des réflexions et des actions. I will go with another question because we had a few questions about it, about your apps that you've shown quickly, because we know that the first studies done by Gehl were like pencil and paper, counting on the street, and then you have this app showing. So could you tell, and I will do the link with another question about that's counting, that's a thing, but how can you also balance it with the space allocation and other data? So maybe could you talk a bit more about the app that you've developed and maybe as well how you manage different kind of data to have like a portrait of public space and strategy for action?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean the public life data app, or the way of doing it, we've worked that out with other cities, Copenhagen, Seattle, and a few other cities, San Francisco. They've been part of developing the tool so that you would have some categories, for instance, of like a standard for staying activities, how you collect that data. So it was also an attempt to do a standard. And then, of course, the app is a tool that makes it easier also to process data and also process it quickly. So you can actually also collect data and then immediately have some results and insights. So we process that afterwards in Alteryx and Tableau, other programs, and then we can also combine it, of course, with other types of data. So I think that's, of course, where it's interesting when you start to combine different types of data. And I should say we've done it before, but a bit more manually, also collecting the data. Yeah, so we've developed the platform, but it's still a beta version, I would say. We're still developing, continuously developing it and trying to find a formula where it's also simple enough to be able to actually process and compare data. And then on the other hand, it is also flexible enough. So we've been able to add categories, for instance, in these days, if needed, in some cities, are people wearing face masks, etc. It can also be on, food, are people, bringing their own food and eating, or it can be non-commercial, commercial seating and so on, different interests that we can add. But of course, there's something about making it simple enough to actually be able to process the data afterwards, but also for the surveyors to be able to collect it, so it's not too complicated. So we're trying to find that balance, but continuously developing it. Yeah.
And some of the question in the box, you're counting, you're looking at data, but how do you do when there's people that are not there? And for instance, we say, well, okay, we look at this place and there's, for instance, no kids or no elders. So how do you take into account the fact that, there might be people there, but they're not there, and how give incentive for the next step?
Yeah. I mean, we also always see it as a significant sign if there are no kids, no elderly, and of course compare it to the general demographic of a certain area or city. But of course it's interesting with the people who are not there, and that's also why I see it as one tool. And then the goal is of course also to collect information from other sources, talk to people, talk to stakeholders, try to, if you cannot talk to the people who are not there, well then try to talk to somebody who knows about, their life and so on. There can also be vulnerable groups that you cannot get, so we try to take it into account, but we always see it as a significant sign if, for instance, in terms of gender, if there's an imbalance, but also, of course, if there are no children or no elderly, it's a significant sign of something being wrong, most likely. Now you're on mute, Véronique, sorry.
Avant d'aller à la prochaine question, dans le fond, ce que Birgitte nous mentionnait sur les éléments, les personnes ou les occupations qu'on n'arrive pas à compter ou qui sont absentes, c'est peut-être là un signe qu'il y a quelque chose qui fonctionne moins bien avec nos espaces publics et qui doit amener une réflexion si on les compare, par exemple, à des données sociodémographiques d'un secteur. Donc, l'absence est aussi une indication, finalement, pour amener des correctifs ou des interventions pour la suite. I will go with another question, because the example you share are, for instance, in downtowns or center commercial street. But we know, for instance, in Canada and as well in Quebec, that there's smaller cities, or that there's, for instance, industrial zone or suburbs setting. So is public life, public space studies relevant for that kind of context, and why should it be done in that kind of context for the professional or for the population?
Yeah, at times they are, and we've used them like really in small towns as well. But of course, there's something about volume, and if you don't have enough it becomes too vulnerable. If you only have one person passing, per hour or whatever it is, then it's no longer relevant. So I think it's always about assessing whether it's the right tool or not. Then it might be better just to walk around, talk to, find different ways of collecting that. So we've also been in some settings where it was better to, for instance, have like a sensor put up because it was actually relevant to see not only like every hour, but throughout the day, the number of people coming and so on, and when and how. So I think it's always about, it's not about, the tool, but it's about the questions, and then you can pick and choose from the different tools, and of course also adapt them and so on. So I think it's, I think the suburbs, the small towns, that's super interesting, and we also work a lot in these places. And also some of the studies from COVID are not from like huge cities or anything, also from smaller towns. And I think it's also very interesting to see similar cities, but doing differently, and then look a little bit closer and see, well, how come that there's a more flourishing local life here compared to there, and so on. So really understanding the different nature of whether neighborhood or different cities and so on. So I think they are usable in all places, but of course you shouldn't just use them like this, but figure out what are actually the right tools. And there is a limit in terms of if it's really a few people that we are talking about, then it's not so relevant to be standing there day after day and hour after hour and counting that one person passing by.
Thank you, Birgitte, for those questions. We arrived to the end of our lunchtime, but the last question was a good link as well with the new publication. L'idée avec la publication sur la vie dans les espaces publics, les études de la vie dans l'espace public au Canada, c'est que nous sommes aussi allés regarder 10 démarches, à la fois à l'échelle d'un centre-ville, mais à la fois dans des villes de taille moyenne ou dans des secteurs, et comment ces études sont menées, quelles sont les manières et surtout ce que mentionnait Birgitte, quel type de questions se poser, quel genre d'indicateurs, dans quelle finalité, comment les conduire. Et de là, toute une série de méthodes ou d'outils sont à la disposition des gens qui souhaitent mener ce type de démarche-là. Et l'idée derrière ça, finalement, c'est de dire, l'important, c'est qu'on ait ces données-là, qu'on connaisse, qu'on sorte finalement de notre jeu habituel de données à grande échelle et qu'on se dise, qu'est-ce qui se passe dans nos espaces publics, qui est là, comment on s'y déplace et comment on est capable finalement d'amener un autre discours et d'autres points de vue aussi et des données pour appuyer des transformations, des réaménagements, des expérimentations dans l'espace public. Cette présentation aujourd'hui est un avant-goût finalement d'une série aussi d'événements qui mise sur cette idée de récolter des données pour bâtir des villes à échelle humaine. Donc, première conférence, comme je le mentionnais d'entrée de jeu, qui est enregistrée et qui sera accessible sous peu. La publication également elle sera en ligne dès aujourd'hui. Et nous vous invitons à un prochain webinaire le 25 février sur l'heure du dîner encore, cette fois-ci avec Marie-Hélène Armand, conseillère en aménagement de la Ville de Montréal, sur vraiment le comment. Et j'ai vu qu'il y a plusieurs questions dans la boîte sur quel type de données on prend, comment on compare, quel genre d'outils, etc. Donc, on va être vraiment sur la réalisation de ça. Et on verra également au courant du printemps pour une formation concrète aussi avec les outils et comment le faire sur le terrain pour s'inspirer. J'aimerais aussi, bien sûr, remercier les partenaires qui ont permettre de tenir cette série d'événements. Donc, bien sûr, nos amis de Gehl, comme je mentionnais, avec 10 ans de collaboration sur la ville à échelle humaine, mais également aussi le Centre intégré universitaire de santé et services sociaux du Centre-Sud et de l'île de Montréal, et bien sûr, l'ensemble de l'équipe du Centre d'écologie urbaine. Je tiens particulièrement à remercier Julien Voyer et l'école aussi d'urbanisme de McGill qui ont amorcé cette recherche qui nous permet aujourd'hui de démocratiser ces connaissances dans l'espace public. J'aimerais faire un petit rappel également d'informations pour vous procurer ces outils ou ces procurer. Donc, sur le site web du Centre d'écologie, la publication, et également sur le site web lesespacespublics.com, vous y retrouvez l'ensemble des outils du coffre à outils, donc traduit en français, adapté avec vraiment aussi des courtes vidéos pour expliquer ou faire le point sur les espaces publics. Donc, I don't know if Birgitte, you have like a final word you want to add on this talk on public life, public space studies.
Of course, I want to say thank you to you all, but maybe just a final note that came to my mind also on the small town topic and so on and everyday life. I think it's super important also to go a little bit more indoor when you're out in those places. So look at the supermarkets, libraries, all those places where people are. So also not only looking at public spaces, but also more like third places or whatever you want to call them, the other spaces. But that was just a final note. And I think the important thing is that we try to understand our cities better and use all the tools we can and collaborate on that. I think that's really great. And then hopefully we can make some better cities also for the future to come. But thank you very much for joining me today. It was a pleasure being with you, almost, but on the distance. Thank you very much for inviting me.
Thank you. Donc, merci beaucoup à tout le monde d'avoir assisté ce midi à ce premier événement d'une série de 3. Je pense que ça nous rappelle tous d'aller profiter aussi pleinement de nos espaces publics dans le contexte actuel et de s'en servir également comme un levier pour des villes durables et résilientes pour la suite. Alors, merci beaucoup. On vous invite à vous procurer les outils et à suivre l'ensemble des prochains événements. Bonne fin de journée tout le monde.